Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers, and welcome to this latest episode of the Landscape Material series. In today's tutorial we'll look at adding colour variation to the textures to further promote realism in the landscape. So let's get straight into it. So in this and the next episode we're going to look at introducing variation to our landscape. So in today's tutorial we're going to look at colour variation, and in next episode we'll look at varying the tiling patterns, all to bring a bit more realism to the landscape. So this is where we got to last week. We have now got 5 layers including a snow layer. The playlist is shown in the description below, so make sure you've got to this point before proceeding with today's episode. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a noise mask. We'll actually use the same noise mask as the snow we used last week, and we're going to use this to vary the shades of the colours on the landscape, again to give a bit more variation. So we could do this in the master material, but it's probably neater to put it into its own material function, and then we could even use it in per material instead of on the whole landscape. I'm actually going to do it for the whole landscape, but I'll talk about how you could do it per material if you wanted to do it that way, or per layer I should say. So let's go into our content browser, make sure you're in the materials and material functions folder, and we'll create a new material function. So go in here and go into material, new material function, and we'll call it MF color variation, and open that up. So what we'll do is we'll create an input. So if you do function input here, and we'll call that input material, and change the input type to material attributes, and the output we'll call color variation material. So this function will take in the material without any color variation, and at the end of it we'll have the material with the color variation applied. So we only want to affect the base color with our variation here. So we haven't done this before, but if you're passing in a material, how do you extract the base color and write the base color? Well, what you do is you do get material attributes, and then on the right here you specify what attributes you want to get. So if you do plus here, you can then specify it. So it's done base color as default, which is what we want, but you can see all of the other attributes are available to you as well, and you can get multiple attributes at the same time. So we're going to get our base color from the earlier functions, and then we're going to do something to it, and then we need to set it again. So there is an equal and opposite function here, set material attributes. So again we can add a element here, base color, and let's just pass the material attributes to that, so it's setting it on the right material attributes node, and that will go to our output. Okay, so we've got our base color, we're going to set our base color, we need to do something in between. So let's create a little bit of space here, and what we will do is we'll use a noise texture in order to apply the shading to the base color. So right click, and if you do texture sample, we've done this before, and what we'll do is we'll select the same noise sample that we imported for the snow. So if you use this texture selector here, and you find the snow edge noise here, you can then again make sure you set the sample source to shared wrap. We always do that. So what we want to do first of all is specify the tiling for the texture sample. So let's give a control for how tiled this texture sample is, this noise sample. So we've done this before. We take our landscape coordinates and we divide by a parameter. So use S on your keyboard, and we'll create a new parameter, and we'll call this color variation tiling size. and we probably want this to be quite large. So let's set the default value to something like 1000 and put that into the divide. So that gives us our UVs for the tiling, the noise sample. Okay, so now we have the noise. What we can do is we can multiply our base color by our texture sample in order to change the color of that. Now, because this texture sample, if I open it up, let me go into this just briefly, you don't have to do this. You can see it's just a grayscale image, so it won't actually change the color. All it will do is lighten and darken the color. If you want to, you can use colored masks here, or you could add another texture sample or color node to multiply by the color as well to tint the color. Generally speaking, just adding light or shade to the colors is enough to provide the variation you want. So let's now take our base color and do a multiply, and we'll then take the output of here and multiply it, and then we'll set that as our output. We'll do more in a minute. At the moment we're just doing the variation at 100% at the moment, but we want to provide some controls for deciding how much of the variation we want. Okay, so at the moment we have a single parameter color variation tiling size. Actually, let's create in this parameter, let's create a new group for it. So let's call it landscape color variation. So click save here. Let's go back to our texture here, and if we go into, we actually haven't put it into the master material yet. So we have this function here to apply variation, but we haven't put it into the master landscape. So go back to your master material, and just before the final output, let's move that along a bit. So from here, we want to add in that master function. So find the master function, material function that you've just created, drag it in here. You can see that it has an input and an output. So we'll plug it in here. So material comes out and material goes to the final output. And let's click on save. Okay, and now you can see this horrible blotchy pattern. So it's kind of what we want, but it's overdone at the moment. We see it's made very dark in patches. We want to have more fine controls over the amount of variation we have here. So let's add some. Let's add another parameter to vary the intensity of that. So come back to your material function. And what we'll do now is we will do an intensity value. So let's copy this with Control D. Let's call this one color variation intensity. And that will be, let's say by default it's 0, so it's off. And what we want to do now is just use our linear interpolate to go between the base color as it is without any changes to the full variation. So we'll use our friendly lerp node, L on the keyboard, left click. So we'll go from the base color on its own to the fully varied base color. And then the output will now go into the base color here. And the control of this will be this color variation intensity. So by default set to 0. So let's save that and let's go and test this out. So at the moment, no intensity here. You can see at the bottom of our material instance, we have our new parameters here. So I make the color variation intensity 1. It's full amount, which we don't want. If we make it 0.5, 0.6 or 0.7, actually 0.7 is pretty good. So you can see that it's just added those patches. And if we want it over sort of narrower parts of the landscape, we could change the variation tiling. So you can see you can make the tiling close together, further away. Actually 500 looks quite nice as well. So you can play around with that. So that's pretty good, but it would actually be good to have the ability to change the contrast of this noise as well. So this is quite a soft blend. You might want a harder blend between the two. So let's add in a contrast as well control. We've done that before. So we can go back to our material function, and what we can do is when this output comes here from the texture sample, let's just move these over slightly. What we can do is we can add a contrast. So from our RGB output, look for cheap contrast and plug it in here. And then we've got a contrast control. So again, let's create a new parameter. Let's copy this one. Let's call it color variation contrast. We'll make the default 0 and plug that in here. And something else we'll do here as well is the intensity. We only ever want it to be between 0 and 1 because it's going into alert. So you've seen me do this before. If we use a saturate node here, it clamps that value between 0 and 1. So if we put in a negative value, it'll be 0. If we put in 2 or 3, it'll be 1. And again, let's just move that over slightly. Okay, and save that. And again, we can do a test. So come back here, we've got a new parameter here called color variation contrast. So if we make the contrast 1, you can see that there is now much more marked edge between the masked area and the unmasked area. So you might prefer that. So you can play around with these two parameters now, the contrast intensity, and blend them. So if we bring the intensity down, that still looks sort of realistic, especially if we kind of get close up. But it's a different look to if we have the contrast at 0 and the intensity up a bit. That's a sort of a softer variation, but it gives us more control. Okay, so that's pretty much the material function done. One last thing I want to do in this material function is have a switch to switch it on or off. I know that an intensity of 0 effectively switches it off, but it's always useful to have a Boolean switch so it doesn't have to go through any calculations if you don't want it on. So let's go back to our main landscape here, and what we'll do is we'll do a switch before the final output. So just right click here and do static switch and choose the static switch parameter, and we're going to call this parameter add color variation, and we're going to put it in the landscape color variation group. You'll have to type it in because it doesn't know in the master landscape that that group exists. Just call it, give it the same name as the other ones here. And if we set that to true, then we want to take the output from this color variation. And if it's false, then we want to take the output without the color variation added at all. Something like that. And we can just put a comment around here now and call this color variation. Make the default false here. Let's save that. Go back here, and you can see we now have a overarching switch here. So you can't see the other parameters at the moment because we're not using the color variation at the moment. As soon as we switch it on, then we see the other controls, and you've got the ability to set the color variation as you wish. Let's go into the material function, and what I want to do is have the color variation intensity as the first parameter. So let's make that sort priority 1. Make the contrast the second parameter, and the tiling size the third parameter. Click on save. So now we have intensity, variation, contrast, and tiling size in that order. So while we're here in the master material, let's do a little bit of optimization and tidying up around this blending part. What would be useful is if we could add some switches, just like the add snow here. we can have some switches depending on whether we want to add the cliffs mid-high or mid-low layers. We'll assume there'll always be a ground layer at a minimum. And this will make the material instance more streamlined if we don't have those layers switched on, and it will also make the material more performant because it won't have to go through calculating those materials and masks if we're not using them. So if you come out a bit here, and we'll select this whole section of the blend and to the final output, and just move it along a bit to create some space, and let's work our way through. Let's start off with the cliff material here. So just take these 4 nodes and move them along a bit. And what we'll do is we'll create a new parameter. So you can steal the add snow one here. So do a Control D on add snow and move it up here. And we'll call it add cliff and put it into the cliff group. Sort priority 0, so it'll be first there. And if add cliff is true, then we want to take the output that we've blended here and then put that into the next blend. If the add cliff is false, then we want to ignore this blend here and just take the mid-high material from here. So we want to take that and put that into there. So let's just move that around there a bit. So we can tidy this up later, but that's the general approach for this switch. So we want to do the next layer. So again, let's move these ones back. And again, we're going to create a new switch. So take this one, duplicate it, move it over here, and this one is going to be called add mid-high. We're going to put it into the mid-high group, and if it's true, we'll take our blend from the previous one and then put that into the next blend. If it's false, we want to just take the mid-low material on its own. So we're working our way down, deciding whether we want to switch these things on and off, and that will then bypass the blend of the higher layers. And then we just want to do this one more time. So select everything up to this blend, move it along a bit, and we want to now copy the add mid-high. So duplicate that, call it add mid-low, put it into the mid-low group, and if it's true, we want, in fact, we want both as outputs. So if you want to move 2 outputs together, you can use the Control key, and it'll turn to a little hand when you hover over a point, and then you can just drag both those elements over there, and then we can put this in here. And if it is false, then we want to take the ground material on its own. And now we have a cascading blend with switches. Decide whether you want that layer included or not. And now would probably be a good time to take that whole section here. Let's move it back slightly, and let's put a comment around it and call that comment blend layers. And let's test that out. So click on save. You do a Control-Shift-S to save everything. You can see that we've just got the ground layer at the moment because it's defaulting, well, and the snow, as we've added the snow as well. So if we look at our material, you can see that we have landscape general, ground, mid-low. We don't even have the other layers because we can only add going up. So if we add the mid-low layer, then we now have grass. And you can see now we have the option to add the mid-high layer. So effectively it's acting like a cascade of the previous layers above it. So we want to add the mid-high layer. We can do that. Now we have the soil, and now finally we have the option to add the cliff layer. So now we have everything as before. And those attributes for the materials only appear if you've actually selected this, because if you're not selecting this, then the previous materials haven't been routed anywhere near the final output. So let's just test it out completely. Turn off snow, that's fine. Turn off the cliff. Turn off the mid-high. Turn off the mid-low, and we're left with just a dirt layer. You can see in our parameters here that it's much more streamlined now. We don't see all of the unnecessary parameters, and it is a more performant material as well. We still have our color variation options. We can still add snow separately, but all the other layers will only appear when you add them, going up from mid-low, mid-high to cliff. So that's the end of today's episode. As always, hope you found it helpful. In the next episode, we'll look at doing tiling variations. So we're going to break up this kind of grid effect. You can see that with these textures, you can still see that they're going in a straight line. So what we'll do is we'll use a technique to break those up and add further realism to the landscape. So I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.